Hi, you're watching DNA Today, a multi-award winning genetics podcast where we explore everything to do with genetics, from CRISPR to rare diseases to new research. We have won the Science and Medicine Podcast Award for many years now. We have hundreds of episodes, and we really hope you enjoy these conversations where we dive into so many genetic concepts. I'm Kira Deneen, a certified genetic counselor, and your host. What would you do if you had the opportunity to secure millions of dollars in funding to transform the future of genetic counseling? Well, instead of wondering, I actually get to interview someone today in person at the University of Pennsylvania to talk about how she was able to do this and give us some insider tips on this. I'm sitting with Kathy, I believe we're going to go with, Valverde, who, as I said, lucky for you listeners, has been able to secure nearly $20 million in grants. And we're going to talk about what those grants are for. And again, insider tips on how she's been able to do this. For those that don't know, Kathy is also the program director here at the University of Pennsylvania's Genetic Counseling Program. And she is the principal investigator for these two grants from the Warren Alpert Foundation. So we're going to talk about how Kathy has really done such a beautiful job in our field over the last few decades with this grant funding and just the profound impact it has and will continue to have in advancing the field of genetic counseling. So Kathy, thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure. Happy to be here.
So let's talk about what initially motivated you to pursue grant funding as a way to advance our field of genetic counseling, because I don't hear of a lot of genetic counselors openly talking about grant funding. And thanks to Ellen Matloff highlighting you on my Gene Council, I was like, I know Kathy, you interviewed me during genetic counseling grad school applications. And I was like, oh, maybe I'll be able to chat with you on the show about this.
I guess I've been a program director a long time, almost 40 years. And very often I would meet students who really struggled with being able to pay to come to genetic counseling program. And when we talk about increasing diversity and access, that can sometimes be a big barrier. So when I worked at Arcadia University, one of our alum gave me some money to start a scholarship for students of diverse backgrounds. And that was very successful. Before we moved to the University of Pennsylvania, we enrolled 2 students in that scholarship program. Her name was Eileen Wolf, so shout out to her for doing that. And then after we moved to from Arcadia to the University of Pennsylvania, the Vassar Center for BRCA, they were able to raise money for us to obtain a scholarship that at the time was earmarked for students who came from Black or Latinx populations, because there's a lot of evidence that shows you women from those populations don't come for genetic testing and screening and get diagnosed with breast cancer at a later rate and have a harder time being treated. So that kind of work started me on the idea of figuring out that we need to find ways to support genetic counselors into this field. If we want to diversify the field, money is a barrier. Scholarship funding would make it easier. And there's a lot of scholarship funding for other professions, and we just don't have as much money available.
You've done such amazing work and impacted so many students' lives that probably not have been able to become genetic counselors and get this higher education without these scholarships. Is there something that you experienced in your personal life and upbringing and joining the field that really pulled at your heartstrings to say, I want to help people in terms of what you've been through?
Yeah, absolutely. So I often don't tell my students this. It's not like I'm trying to hide it. It just happened so long ago. But my mom had a BRCA1 variant, and she died of breast cancer when I was 12. And my father died very unexpectedly when I was 16. And I was 17 getting ready to go to college. And there were very different laws back then in the late 70s, early 80s. And I was ineligible for all forms of student loans and scholarships because I was inheriting property. We didn't have any money to go to college. And so I eventually was able to go on a special fund that they had at the New York State to go to college. But that was really hard, thinking I want to go to college like everybody else I know, but I can't because I fall through the cracks of all the scholarships and all the grants. So I've met students over the years. I've probably interviewed, I've been running a program for almost 30 years. I've probably interviewed, 3,000 people who want to be genetic counselors, and some of them come to me with similar stories. And I thought we really need to help those people who want to be genetic counselors who just don't have the fun.
Because like you, if you hadn't gotten those scholarships early on for undergrad, and then you probably got hopefully some for grad school, how would you have become a genetic counselor? We wouldn't have you in the field and all of the amazing work you've done.
It's really important. And, just to hear the story behind it, not to make assumptions about why one student might need the money over another. And I wish I had more. I mean, I tell my students, it's my goal. I wish I had scholarship money for everyone. It pains me to have to decide who gets the scholarships, but we're doing the best we can right now. So I hope other people take this as a gauntlet too and try to find more scholarships.
It certainly is a really big barrier of just there's less foundations that are set up in maybe marketing and advertising that, hi, we have funds for genetic counseling, as opposed to other programs like I'm thinking probably for nurses and other similar career paths that have a lot of parallels to genetic counseling.
True. And so the other, I think the reason why I became more involved with this too is I had a student many years ago who told me she went to a historically Black college, and she told me that when the time of year came around to talk about internships, there were lots of internships in other disciplines, public health, nursing, physician. And so she said there isn't even a way to get into the pipeline because we have to do, shadowing experiences and, crisis text line counseling, and very often people from lower socioeconomic status can't take their summers to do that. So we started the summer scholarship program, we call it summer scholars, but it's an internship program here. And we did that for 1 year, just getting funding from the university. And I think between having the summer scholars program that ran, the scholarship at the Bassler Center, and the scholarship I had at Arcadia University, it gave me some traction to apply to the Warren Alpert Foundation.
Did you face any issues with having to explain what genetic counseling was, the importance of our field, because other professions are more established than ours, but also just knowing like what is the impact that genetic counselors have in society, in healthcare? Because that to me would probably be the first barrier to be like, hi, this is who we are and this is why we need money.
I was fortunate because the Warren Alpert Foundation understood what genetic counselors did. They had done some research. They had a genetic counselor who was on an advisory committee who gave them some understanding of what the roles were. Many of the board of directors were physicians in the area, in the Boston and Rhode Island area, because the foundation's in Rhode Island. So that wasn't a barrier. They understood that. Their major concern was there's an explosion in genetic testing, and will all facets of our population be able to have access to genetic counseling? And the access often comes from people that look like me, and can we diversify the genetic counseling profession so that way patients would feel more comfortable? So it was, in that sense, that part was easy. They understood what we did. What was more challenging was figuring out how to organize.
And from my understanding, the grant supports two main programs. Did I get that right?
Yes. Two grants from the Warren Alpert Foundation. The first one is called the Alliance for Genetic Counseling. And in that grant, that's about $9.5 million. We are sponsoring, it was 40 genetic counseling students at 5 institutions. So we have a consortia. It's the University of Pennsylvania, Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, the University of Maryland Medical School, Sarah Lawrence College, and Boston University. So each of them take 2 students a year. And I had done some research on the idea of clustering when you have students of different backgrounds who are similar to each other across multiple programs. They would have a community, a sense of community in their own cohort. So each of our students come to us once a year in person here in Philadelphia, and once a year in person in Boston. Then in the other months of the year, 10 months of the year, we do monthly fellowships meetings. So they have a cohort within their own program, and then they have a cohort within the Warren Alpert, which are students. And we used criteria at the time that were written for the NIH. It was students from racial, ethnic minorities, first generation college, students who came to were undergraduates with Pell or McNair scholars, or who came from a rural background, or individuals with disabilities.
That's wonderful to be able to bring people into our profession that may not have been able to afford getting into school and being able to have all the expenses that goes with it. It's not just the tuition money, but it goes beyond that. You think of living expenses in some of these cities, especially Boston, New York. I mean, these are expensive places to live, let alone when you're a student making no income.
So the students get full tuition benefit, health insurance, and they also get educational fellowship, a stipend. It's similar to the stipends that PhD students would get.
So that's one of the programs. How about the other one?
The other one is called the Career Ladder Education Program, and that has 3 arms. The first arm, so I had gone to a Pennsylvania State Genetic Counselors meeting, and it was in a more rural part of our state. And one of my alum had come up to me and said, this is an amazing conference. Most of the people who present come from Pitt or from the University of Pennsylvania or the Philadelphia area. I work at a small community hospital in the middle of the state, and I don't have access to any continuing education. And I said, and she says, it's really hard to stay up to date. And I said, okay. And I thought about that. So the Warren Alpert Career Ladder grant pays for continuing education courses, and they're free for all genetic counselors. The first 250 people who register for the course get their CEUs paid for by the Warren Alpert Foundation grant. We've done 2 so far. The first one was a variant curation, genomic technology. The second one is bioethics. The first one was created here at Penn with the help of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. The second course was coordinated by Northwestern University. And the third one will be by the University of Washington. And the other 2 programs in our consortia are Vanderbilt University and Baylor College of Medicine.
Wow. Especially the variant curation one. Like, as someone that graduated in 2020, only 5 years ago, we touched on that, but we didn't dive into it as much as I'm think would have been helpful if I went that route in my career, or if I do in the future. And even just of working in clinic, it's helpful to know more of how that works on the back end. So that's such a useful workshop.
And I can tell you, it's been very well received. Majority of the people who've taken the course have given it highly satisfied or mostly satisfied. It's even reached internet.
That's amazing.
Second arm of the program is even, I think, more exciting for genetic counselors. So there are 25 grants that were established by the NIH, which we applied for when we were not funded. Other genetic counseling programs were funded, but they were looking to find ways to train genetic counselors to do research without getting a PhD. So we call it the ART-GC. It's the Advanced Research Training Certificate Program. We enroll 10 students a year, again, 2 from each of the 5 programs to have this cohort feel. It's mostly asynchronous, except we have 1 meeting a week, which is synchronous, where we talk about the coursework. So the students it's a 1-year program. They take 2 classes in the fall, 2 classes in the spring, and they do a mentored research project. And I can tell you, we buy back 50% of their effort, so they have time to work on that project. And that's really been the beauty of the project, is that they have time to work on it. They have mentoring, and they have support, because a lot of the genetic counselors had great ideas. They just didn't know how to sort of formulate them into research topics. Very often, genetic counselors work on research protocols, but they're not of their own design. They usually are added on to a project. So this program is helping genetic counselors learn to become their primary.
That's wonderful, because we need a lot more genetic counselors being the PIs, of looking at that research, because genetic counselors are going to see issues and areas that need to be explored, and having a unique lens compared to other healthcare providers. So that is really important to have that. And you said that was the second arm. So is there a third? Okay.
The third arm is we're going to have a symposia in June of 2026, where we're going to talk about the educational goals post-graduate degree for genetic counselors. The R25 is training genetic counselors. We're running the certificate program, but what kind of educational opportunities, CEUs? So we're going to have a conference to really look at the whole, I say, library of things that we might be able to offer genetic counselors to continue their certification for continuing education, because everything moves so fast.
It does. And a lot of employers will pay for continuing education, but not all, or there's a lot of stipulations to it where you have to use PTO to go to these, or you're only funded up to this amount of money, or you can only go every other year. So it is really great that I think in the past 2 years, there's been more of a focus from a lot of different organizations to have more continuing education accessible and affordable to genetic counselors.
When I wrote the grant, we really envisioned that the genetic counselors who came for this RTC program would be 2 or 3 years out of their graduate training. But just because of the market and sort of the job market, we've had some that came right out of their their graduate training in genetic counseling. And it's really been quite remarkable to see the more senior counselors support the younger. So we've really, this cohort project and this mentoring, I would say, if I had to give 2 benefits of what I've learned from both grants, is mentoring is so important. The cohort is so important, having a network.
That's such a huge part of it, and being able to connect with others and have others in these cohorts that you can go to process. Oh, I'm having this issue. Have you had this? And just that feeling of having that peer mentorship, as well as you said, having people that have been in the field longer and having more of that traditional mentor-mentee relationships.
Right. So both grants, the students get a peer mentor. In the COLLEPT-DC, they get a research mentor. In the genetic counseling students, they get a professional genetic counseling mentor. So yeah, it's been very helpful.
How are you looking at the long-term effects? And I imagine a lot of grants have to put some kind of labels, metrics on, well, we've given you X amount of money. We want to see after so many years that there's been an improvement, there's been an influence in the field, an impact. How do you begin to measure that with these types of programs?
Tell you how we're doing it in the grant, the Alliance for Genetic Counseling. Of our summer interns, we've had 3 years of summer interns equaling 35. Each genetic counseling program takes 2 or 3 summer interns. Of the 35 summer interns we've had, 14 are still in college. They haven't graduated, but of the 21 who did graduate, 8 got into genetic counseling programs on their first time, and they all represent people from various backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences. So that I find is, and
That's a great stat right off
yeah.
the bat.
And it's not just in the Alliance program, not of all of our 5 programs, they've gone to programs nationally. So I think that's very encouraging. My second cohort of Warren Alpert scholars, we had 100% pass rate on the board exam. The 9 that graduated in 2025, they all passed the board exam. 2/3 of them are employed already. The rest are still looking for jobs. So I feel like those have been really good outcomes. We've also been doing a long-term qualitative study, which is being run by the Mixed Methods Research Lab here at Penn, because we all teach the students and work with them. So I wanted them to be able to be transparent. So that study is just going to wrap up next year when we graduate, now that we've taken our 4th cohort of master's training genetic counselors. And we are finding that the students really, they're so appreciative of the financial support. Some of the students have said to me, it's the first time in my life I did have to work, and now I can just be a student. The mentoring gets very high marks. So I think these supports are really making them feel like they belong and they're competent and they can devote themselves to their studies. So I think it's been really great.
And just investing in our career of we have these fantastic individuals that are now going to pay it forward. So I think from a financial standpoint, it's an investment into our profession and already paying off, which is amazing to hear because these students and recent grads are at the very beginning of their careers. So you just imagine everything that they're going to accomplish in the next few decades and all the future students that you'll have. So there's a lot of people that are going to be listening to this or watching that say, well, that's great, but Kathy's been in the field for 40 years and she's got so much experience. She's so well known. Of course, she was able to get such an amazing grant, but little old me can't do it. So what advice do you have for people that might be thinking that, having a little imposter syndrome and feel intimidated by writing grants?
I think the first thing I can say is if you have a good idea, you have to be invested in it. You have to really support it. And once you have that idea and you support it, then you need to find mentors and you need to find a network. And there are some very small grants you can get. You need to start a track record. You can apply for the Awardee Special Project Grants, the JEMF Special Project.
All through NSGC so far.
Then you can go to small foundations. The original money I got very long time ago was from the hospital I worked at. They had small grants that you could apply for. I got a small grant from Arcadia University. Then we went on to get, a small grant from local organizations. I think you start that way. And then you have to have, I think, being very honest, working at the University of Pennsylvania gave me some connections. I work with some PIs who helped me write the R25 grant. So I had a mentor and she helped me figure out the best way to write the grant. So then I had more, I would say, detailed experience about how to write a grant. Part of what we do in the RTC training is we have a course on manuscript writing and grant writing. And I think the first time you apply for a grant, you have to be honest and know you're probably not going to get it. Or if you get it, it's going to be tweaked, but that's okay. Then you learn from it. Every time you apply, you're going to learn something. It'll probably be a better project when you resubmit it. So I think that's the way you just have to.
Yeah, that's great advice of just starting smaller so you have a few under your belt so that when you're applying to those bigger grants, you can say, well, I have experience in this. And even just the experience of going through and getting those grants is going to be helpful because, as you said, you figuring out and hopefully having someone that you're bringing in on the team that has even more experience than you. I joke, we just did a presentation to your students. And so, talking about networking, like so much comes down to networking in our careers.
And I've been very fortunate. I've had some really amazing mentors back to when I started in this profession, physicians and scientists who really taught me. My first physician I worked for was the editor of pediatrics. So I started, she'd say to me, oh, you need this article. It's interesting. What do you think? I worked for Debbie Ampe, who was the first editor of the Journal of Genetic Counseling. So, you need to have a track record in publication too, because then, they're going to vet you. The foundation is going to vet you, whoever you're asking the money for, and you're going to have a track record. So I think it's important if you, whatever your interest is, that you make a story with it. Like, this is how I started, and then this is what I did the following years, and so on and so forth. So then that way, when the foundation vets you, they'll see that this has been a long-term interest of yours, and you're, published in that area, and you're committed to it.
Maybe that even starts with thesis project and keeping it going to get to publication, because a lot of students, including myself, did not see through to have thesis be published. So I think that's a good place for a lot of students to start, because you've already put a lot of work into it.
Absolutely. And, we try very hard to encourage our students to do that, but it's difficult. You graduate, you have to take the board exam, you get a new job. So you really need a mentor. I think that's been the key in all the things we've talked about. It's networking and mentorship, someone you can go to that you feel safe saying, I don't know how to do this, or I'm unsure.
Asking your quote unquote stupid questions that probably aren't stupid.
Right,
so yeah, no, I attest to that. I've had a lot of mentors over my career that I don't know where I would be without their support and guidance along the way of, hey, Kira, you're doing this, but did you think of this part? I'm like, no, I did not. Thank you for pointing that out. So when it comes to writing a strong grant proposal, you've certainly learned a lot over the years. What are some aspects that are important for people to keep in mind when it comes to sitting down in front of the blank screen and saying, okay, I'm going to start writing this?
Just like I tell my students when they think about their thesis projects, you should have 1 to 3 specific aims. You have to be really targeted in what you're asking for, and make sure those aims align with whatever the foundation's, RFP is, or whatever their interests are in. But I think you have to get like your elevator pitch. You have to have, a few sentences where you can explain what's important to you and why you want it. I think that's really key. And then I think you need to just do it. Sometimes we say, oh, it might not be good enough for this, but, write it, show it to someone who's written grants before, bring on other people to help you. And I think that if you're committed to it, just keep looking and not to be discouraged. J.K. Rowling, went to many publishers. Many before she got her books published, and we know the end of that story.
Yeah.
You just have
a magical ending, I'd say. Going on our magic theme here, if you had a magic wand and you could have one or a couple issues in the field resolved, what would some of those be? Because maybe that will inspire some people listening that have time to start working on these projects. Because I think you have enough on your plate.
Yeah. To be honest with you, people always ask me, why'd you pick the programs that you worked with, And I know we picked the programs in the Northeast because I had this idea. I wanted the students to meet in person. I think that's really important, especially coming out of the pandemic when we wrote the grant. So I actually called it my Northeast extension, so we had the railroad, the Amtrak. And then when we went to write the second grant, we went nationally because we were looking for genetic counseling programs that had very strong research arms to it. So I think when you think about the things that worry me now, I think we really have to make sure that we have billing under control. I think we really need to figure that out.
Because we have the new billing code, but you mean more in terms of how are we using it?
Will payers pay for it? Making sure that genetic counseling services are reimbursed for. I mean, we work very hard, but sometimes it's hard to show your employer that the hours you're working are not billable hours, or they're billed in ways that aren't tracked back to the genetic counselor. So I think some real good studies on billing. I'm also concerned about the cost of our education in genetic counseling. I think that's something else we need to look at. So there's just things that, or whatever you see in your environment. When we tell the students to think about a thesis project, we always tell them, think about something that interests you. Because if you're not interested in it, it's not going to be fun doing it. You have to want to do it. Yeah. Did we have some rocky roads when we first started the grant, working with 5 different institutions, figuring out how we were going to, write contracts and sub-awardees? Yes. But now we're seeing the benefits of that because it's working well. So you just have to know it's not going to be perfect, but you just keep trying.
Yeah, chip away at some of these issues. I don't think you're ever going to resolve, even with the amazing work you're doing. You're not resolving the issue, but you're putting a massive dent into the solution and saying, okay, we're working towards this. And going back to billing for a moment, as soon as the new code was announced, it was like right the week of NSGC. We caught up with Colleen and Brian afterwards, and so they came on the show. So I'll link to that in the show notes because they gave a lot of good information, especially Brian, just in terms of his experience of he leads a genetic counseling team in Texas, and for him to say, this is how my team is using it.
So as soon as we had the billing code, we put together a small cohort of genetic counselors here who went to our billing offices here at Penn and who went to our payer providers and tried to figure out how this was going to get implemented. But sometimes I think genetic counselors think somebody else is going to do it for them.
No, we have to do it.
We do it ourselves. We have to roll up our sleeves and do it ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And I think when I'm looking at the future of genetic counseling, to echo the concerns you've had is certainly there. I think part of it too is just looking at how genetic counselors are valued and ways that we can position ourselves that we're valued to a lot of our counterparts in healthcare.
Yeah.
And that's a very vague statement to make. So if someone can make that into more articulate thoughts and action items, but I think just being able to say, okay, we are genetic experts and we see patients, but we also have people that do a lot of different aspects in healthcare, and being able to expand upon that and see that our field did start with and very humble roots of people like yourself going out there and saying, we're building this profession, and having to do a lot of marketing without probably realizing you were doing marketing.
Absolutely true. I was in the 15th graduating class at Sarah Lawrence. So many of the people that taught me or were my clinical supervisors were in the first and second graduating classes. So yeah, I've been fortunate to see an entire field grow, develop.
Have you seen any, history repeats itself? So have you seen any trends that you're like, oh, this is an issue that seems to pop up that we kind of had before?
Sometimes I think we've talked a lot about advanced degrees as one, and people are always talking about, well, what will happen to the people who have masters in genetic counselors if you get an advanced degree? And I keep saying, there's room for everybody at the table. Most other allied health professions, social work, have doctors in social work, and nurses have doctors in nurses, and they do different jobs. They use the work in fields, or work in training programs, or educational areas, or they write grants, or they do research. So I don't think we should hold our whole, profession back by being so concerned. I think there's plenty to go around. So if somebody's interested in wanting to get an advanced degree, they should go and do that. And that, then they have a different skill set. So when you get an advanced degree, they often teach you how to write grants, or when you're working as a clinical genetic counselor, it's really hard to find the time to do all these extra things. I was fortunate. We weren't as busy when we worked as genetic counselors in the 80s and 90s when I was a practicing genetic counselor. There just wasn't as much to do. There weren't as many tests to order. There wasn't much to follow up on. So I aligned this to, I remember when the first genetic counselors went to work for labs. It was like, oh, they're leaving the profession, and
you were going on the dark side back
exactly.
then.
Now, many genetic counselors go to work for other kind of companies or advocacy groups. And I think there's plenty to go around. So I think we should support one another in whatever areas we can grow genetic counseling. That, I think, answers your question. How do we get more awareness about genetic counseling?
Just like we did in our roots of starting out with just one specialty, then expanding into prenatal cancer and kind of growing. And now we have how many specialties? I mean, it's just
every department in the hospital here.
Wow, I like that stat. That's impressive. Yeah, there's over 100 genetic counselors that work at Penn and the associated organizations here. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kathy, for coming on the show. I mean, you are such a wealth of wisdom of seeing so many decades of genetic counseling and what we've been through, and seeing those trends and projecting where we're going and trying to anticipate some of the needs we'll have and addressing them now. It's so important. And just on behalf of the profession, thank you. But also on behalf of all the students that, I think over 400 students you've had a hand in. So you can hang in there to do 500?
Although we take 18 students a year.
So yeah,
5 more years.
That's true. Maybe we can convince you to stay on board.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you, having us here just so that we can also record this in person. And shout out to Corinne, who's been behind the camera as one of your former students and a huge presence on DNA Today. So thank you, Corinne. Thanks for watching DNA Today. To access all of our episodes, head over to dnatoday.com. We also have a lot of bonus content on there that you can enjoy. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, guest pitches, you name it, send them in to info@dnatoday.com. We'd also really appreciate if you could take a moment to rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to the show. It really helps more nerds like yourself find the show. Also, if you like giveaways and other ways to connect with us, I recommend following us on social. We're at DNA Today Podcast. We also have a Patreon if you want to be the most level involved in the show. That's also at DNA Today Podcast. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Join us next time to learn and discover new advances in the world of genetics.